Alrighty, I think we can begin. Some more people will join. If you've just logged on, welcome. This is Connecticut River Conservancy's live stream. My name is Stacy Leonard. I'm the events coordinator here at CRC. We have a lot of people coming on the line, so some folks may join midstream. If you miss the beginning or any part of it, just know this is being recorded and we'll share how you can see the recording at the end. LiveStream is our lunchtime presentation series where you get to learn more about the rivers you love and ask questions and be in the comfort and safety of your home. We're excited to bring our work and our rivers to you in this new format. We're here for episode 3 called Free Our Rivers, Why and How CRC Removes Deadbeat Dams. If you missed our earlier episodes, you can find them at ctriver.org/livestream. Again, all these links will be shared later and in a follow-up email. Before I introduce our speaker, just a couple of little housekeeping tidbits. You'll notice your video and microphone are off, so we can have a quiet conversation, but we do want you to ask questions. You'll see the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. At any time, you can put your questions in there, but we're going to save all questions until the end. I'll remind you again later. If you need any technical help, we have Aliki on the line. She is our Zoom wizard behind the scenes, and you can actually call her if you're having trouble at our CRC number, 413-772-2020, extension 207. The presentation will be about 30 minutes, and then we'll have some time for the Q&A, as I said. So now I'm pleased to introduce to you our speaker today, Ron Rhodes. He is one of CRC's 4 illustrious river stewards. He hails from South Pomfret, Vermont. His primary work concerns river restoration, of which removing deadbeat dams is one aspect, as well as tree planting and working with various partners in the Vermont-New Hampshire region. In addition to wielding a sledgehammer, Ron is an avid fly fisherman and actually taught a fly fishing course at Dartmouth College. He's been lending his experience to CRC since 2011. Fun fact, Ron and his wife packed up their government jobs in DC and Ohio for the river life up north in 1999. And now Ron will help unravel the mysteries of deadbeat dams and why we want them out of our rivers. Please take it away, Ron.
Thank you, Stacy. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to scroll through a series of PowerPoint slides and also click on various videos and clips that might be more interesting than my voice droning on to you. As Stacy said, feel free to ask questions. We will answer them at the end so that we get through the presentation, hopefully smoothly and quickly for you. Now, Stacy and Aliki, I'm not able to advance the screen. There we go. So since 2010, Connecticut River Watershed Council, as we used to be called, now Connecticut River Conservancy, has removed 14 old dams that were no longer serving a useful purpose. So these were not existing flood control dams or power dams that were generating electricity. These were old dams that were built oftentimes, 100 years ago and have just been sitting in the river ever since they went out of commission. The projects that we've done with a whole host of project partners, state and federal government agencies, other nonprofits, and of course the dam owners and all of our funders that make these projects possible. Those 14 projects have opened more than 350 miles of river for fish and other aquatic organism passage. That is, you'll often hear that one phrase used, miles of stream opened, because it's relatively easy to measure, the distance. For example, the picture shown here is the Gear Dam on the Onpompanusick River. We know exactly how many miles, are upstream and downstream of that dam, so that if a fish, once the dam is removed, a fish can swim now throughout that entire watershed or to the next dam or some other barrier. So it's an easily measured metric. There are lots of other reasons that we'll talk about why we remove dams and the benefits of them. But this one is often the one that is held up as, you know, a reason why we're doing these projects. So one thing I want to show to you and give you a feel of today, that every dam is different. Every project is unique. Some of these dams are very small. The one on the right in Dummerston, Vermont, that was on Crosby Brook. We removed that last year. That was in someone's backyard. You know, the folks who bought the property didn't build the dam. It was built back in the 30s to create a swimming pool, basically. The one on the left was a late 70s, early 80s hydro project, small hydro on Cold Brook in Wilmington. The gentleman who built that or had it built was essentially doing his part to help with the oil crisis, and it operated for about 10 years, created, you know, a small amount of energy, and then after that it just became too expensive and it wasn't used anymore, and so was sitting in the river, you know, blocking fish passage. We actually have a video of a small brook trout trying to jump over that 3-foot high dam, unsuccessfully, of course. So some of these are really small. People are, you know, buying properties that have these structures on them and they don't know what to do with them. And so they call the state or a nonprofit like CRC and ask for help. And then other projects are very large. The one in Haverhill, that was Pine Mill Dam. We removed that last year. That was a 180-foot long dam, and the base of the dam was 19 feet thick. So much bigger project, more costly, you know, more time spent on site taking that out. The one in Norwich, it's hard to tell from that picture, but that was an 18-foot high remnant dam that had been breached, was used as a Norwich Reservoir, a drinking water supply back in the 50s. And then, you know, by the 80s, the town had gone to wells and we're never going to use that reservoir again. So we were able to remove that dam in 2018. And, you know, again, big project. You'll see a video later. We took out 753 truckloads of concrete and sediment. So massive projects on some scales. So the benefits, if you go down the left side here, the flooding it can be a big issue. One of the projects we did in 2016 was in East Burke, Vermont, and Passumpsic River. And by removing the dam and the sediment that had accumulated and been trapped upstream of the dam over the years, we were able to lower the flood elevation level by 4 feet. So when I was meeting with the local businesses, some who weren't, you know, too interested in seeing the dam removed because it had been part of the town for a long time, and maybe they don't care about fish passage or brook trout, but when you tell them when the next Irene hits, there's, you know, an extra 4 feet of storage for those floodwaters in the channel, that you know, has an impact and makes a difference for some local folks that are close to the dam. Obviously, reconnecting fish and aquatic organism passage is a benefit of all of these dam removals, no matter how big or small. Vermont and New Hampshire both require dams to be inspected. So if you own a dam, the state will, at some point, they don't do them all every year, but at some point you'll get a letter from one of the state agencies saying that they're going to come out and inspect your dam. And some dams get a high hazard rating. That basically means that if the dam were to fail, life and property are at risk. And high hazard structures must be either repaired or removed. So there are different rules associated with in Vermont and New Hampshire. and all of the other states have slightly different rules. But, you know, as a dam owner, it is a consideration, and it's also a cost. There's like $1,000 fee in New Hampshire. Liability. Some of the projects that we have or have done, dam owners approached us because, you know, we've got a couple that has a daycare business out of their house, and their insurance agent told them if the kids were going to be out back in the backyard, they either had to put up a fence or they had to get rid of the dam because, you know, a kid could wander over and walk out on the dam and fall off. So from an insurance perspective, there's some liability issues for dam owners. And then the last point there is we've had at least one couple that came to us and said they were going to, you know, be selling their house and retiring to Florida, and their real estate agent told them to get rid of the dam prior to putting the house on the market. So each dam owner, you know, might have their own reasons for it. Sometimes the dam owner doesn't approach us. We approach them and say, would you mind if we do this? We get all the grants and funding to make it happen. We don't require the landowners to kick in that, you know, respect. We will need a couple of signatures on some permits and maybe a little bit of their time, but basically it's our job to do all the legwork, essentially serve as their staff person for the project. The right-hand column, again, fish passage is the first bullet as to why we do these. The sediment, that's a big one, that second bullet. So Norwich Dam removal, 750 truckloads of sediment and concrete. East Burke was 600 truckloads of sediment. You know, that sediment that normally moves downriver and goes through the system, right? It comes out of the Passumpsic down to the Connecticut and eventually goes down to the Long Island Sound over maybe, you know, years. But a big concrete wall in the middle of the river tends to disrupt that flow, natural flow. So the sediments get trapped. And in East Burke and Norwich both, the dams were full of sediment. You know, if the Norwich Dam was 18 feet high, there was maybe 1 feet of water at the very top. You know, 17 feet of sediment trapped above that dam. And that leads to the next issue of dissolved oxygen. So fish and other organisms need that oxygen to survive in the river. And when the sediment collects, the dissolved oxygen levels go down, the river warms up, you know, it's shallow, it's warm, less oxygen. So you have less habitat. So we'll work with the state or U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and do some pre-removal assessments. And there are very few fish, hardly any trout, and some bugs, but not many. And then once the dam removal is done, you go back and do those assessments again. And, you know, the life that comes back to that stretch of river is just so much dramatically improved. More fish, more trout, more bugs. We talked about the flooding. You know, these structures are basically like pinch points. A woman that used to work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had a great term. She said they're like clogged arteries in our body. And that dam is like a blood clot. If you think of our arteries, you know, the rivers is equivalent to our arteries. A dam is like a blood clot, and it causes problems. Not just during Irene, but, you know, spring ice and high flows can be a major issue for flooding some of our towns that have these dams. And then, yes, the bottom one is insurance and liability issues also. So that's brief overview of why we do the projects. Now I'm going to get into some of the examples. So 2010, Connecticut River Watershed Council, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Nature Conservancy, and the state of Vermont all partnered on this project on the Swalet River. Dam picture up the top there. And you can see the wood cribbing being taken out by the excavator, and then the post picture of a free-flowing river where fish and people can go up downstream as they will. Hard to see in this picture, but you can also see on the sides here some plantings, and then we'll talk about that later, but restoration is a big part, not only in the river restoration, but the riparian restoration also. 2011, Johns River, another one in New Hampshire. You can see in the top left, the dam was partially breached. You know, a lot of times when these dams go out, they're no longer being used for whatever their original purpose, the mill, whatever. They do breach them to some extent, but they're obviously still barriers and create other problems. Interesting thing here, as you can see in that bottom right, is I've got an arrow. So that dam was still attached to the old mill building, and you don't generally want to start hammering on concrete while it's attached to a structure. So that dam had to be cut first before the concrete could be removed. Makes it a little trickier and certainly more nerve-wracking from a project manager standpoint. All right, so I'm going to show you a couple of videos here. Hopefully this will work. So that gives you an example of the number of partners that it takes to pull one of these projects off. This was my first project as project manager. And to be honest, not even that big of a project. I think we spent $75,000 on the construction. Now here's another video of a project we did in West Fairleigh, Vermont, 2017, with some help from our friends at IBEX, who made this wonderful video for us. All right, so Stacy, you can't hear the sound on those? I got that correct? So Stacy, I think, sent me a message that says guys couldn't hear the sound. Sorry about that. So these projects tend to have a life of, or generate additional projects. We find this often when we're doing tree planting projects. We'll be on a farm planting trees along an eroding stream bank, and folks will see us out there and they either ask us or the farmer, what's going on. And when you explain we're planting trees, and often we'll have folks say, well, how do I get trees on my eroding stream bank? Same thing has happened here with the dam removals. Either via the media, the press comes out and we get a good article in the paper, or public radio comes out and does a story, and then one dam removal leads to a next one. And that's what happened here in Groton. On the Wells River, we did the first one in 2014. While we were doing the project, someone stopped by, because these projects tend to generate a lot of interest and attention. Someone stopped by and said, well, are you going to take the other one out that's downstream? And I said, show me, where is it downstream? And so we went down. It was actually owned by Green Mountain Power. It was a functioning dam for about 2 years. It got destroyed in the 27 flood. And since then, it just been sitting there in the river. So we worked with Green Mountain Power, the town, and lots of other partners, and took out that old concrete and created this picture on the bottom right, post project. I'm going to play this video again, and hopefully you all can hear the sounds. Okay, so sound isn't working. Sorry about that. So that's part of the reason I wanted to show you the videos and the sound, was because these are loud projects. Imagine, that what they call a hoe ram, and there's an excavator with a bucket picking up the concrete and rocks and the sediment. And then there's some second machine with that big hammer on it that is pounding on the concrete incessantly, day after day. Earplugs are good if you're going to be on site, but they are big equipment, loud, buzzers when the equipment's backing up, trucks moving in and out. So it's one reason they draw a lot of attention, because it's not every day you see that going on in the river. So I'm sorry you can't hear that, but it is always a bit of a shock to people. I always try to tell, especially the dam owners and folks, whoever's near, neighbors, etc., that they are going to be big and loud projects. Let's see, video here. This is the small one, so you can't hear that noise, but it is, boom, 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 on a fairly regular basis when they're using the hoe rams to break up the concrete. This is a project we did last year in Dummerston, Vermont. You saw that picture earlier. So we're hiring local contractors, local engineers. So one of the things that I've always talked about with dam removals is that these projects are good for the river, but they're also good for our local economies. The grants that we're receiving, the funding that we're receiving is being spent locally. And especially now with the COVID and all the issues that we're all dealing with now in businesses, we're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars in our local communities to make these projects happen. Like I said, hiring Vermont companies, New Hampshire engineers, contractors from Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and really keeping keeping that money or spending that money locally. So if you want to, talk about shop locally when it comes to our food, well, we're doing the same thing when it comes to dam removals. East Burke, Passumpsic River, 2017, one of our largest miles opened with one single project. We had 99 miles on the Passumpsic River and all of its tributaries. So just above the dam up here is Dish Mill Brook. So when they're measuring the miles, you don't just measure the miles of the main stem river, but also of those tributaries. So again, if a fish were living down below the dam and you take that out, where can that fish now move to? This is one of my favorite projects because the Passumpsic Valley Land Trust bought this dam and then spent 15 years trying to get it removed. They bought it with the purpose of removing it. And they came to us in 2016 and asked me if I would basically take it on and help make it happen. So we did that, and maybe it was 2015 they came to me. And spent a lot of time in East Burke talking with neighbors, businesses, etc. It was part of town. It was part of their history. And so some folks weren't eager to see it go, but it really turned out beautiful. Some of the folks that were, initially opposed to the idea of the dam being gone actually came around once it was done because it looks so good. Here's a video of the project in action. You can see all that sediment on the upstream, right side, and a lot of that 600 truckloads were those two excavators up there with the long arm and the bucket and the one behind it, removing that sediment as we came out. And, there is a way that you do these. You don't just hammer out or blow up the concrete and then start removing the sediment. Basically on this one, we went upstream, way around the bend. You can't even see the extent of the project area, and started removing the sediment upstream and then worked our way down to the dam. We punched a hole in the dam to lower the water and then remove sediment, and then took out a little more of the dam and removed more sediment. And all the sediment goes we have to get those disposal areas approved as part of the permitting process. We get local, state, and federal permits to do all these. So the Army Corps of Engineers wants to know where that sediment is going. We have to have an approved pit. You can't just go dump it in a wetland somewhere. So that is all part of the process early on. We have to find somebody that either needs that fill, which is great, because we can sometimes recycle the material. We've even been able to do that with some of the concrete. Sometimes the towns have taken it and crushed it up and used it for road projects. So we're essentially recycling a 100-year-old concrete dam and, giving that material to the town or someone else that needs that material for clean fill. So it's all done. And this is my favorite picture of any dam removal project I've done now, of the 12 I've done, because that is where the dam used to be in East Burke. So that wood, that tree trunk here and this boulder, were under the concrete, and the falls, the stair step falls, were buried in the concrete and the sediment. And now people are using that stretch of river for all sorts of fun activities, including unicorn floaties. So, and I've got a short video here, giving you another reason or visual as to benefits of dam removal. That's Lynn Giardi from Passumpsic Valley Land Trust. He used to work for Vermont Fish and Wildlife, and he really was the spearhead of this project. Back, got it started, and then asked us to help bring it on. So this was after the dam removal. Again, this is right where the dam used to be, and you didn't have this kind of access or flows. Paddlers are using it. As you saw, the kids are swimming there, fishing, etc. So lots of great recreational benefits to these projects. All right, talked a little bit about historic preservation in East Burke. This sign was from the Norwich Reservoir Dam. That is also part of the process. So when we're going through the permitting and whatnot, we talk to state historic preservation, and we capture that history. So we do a report, and that gets shared with the town historic society. And then we often are doing, if it's a public place, not in someone's backyard, but if it's more of a public dam, then we're doing these signs. It adds a little bit of cost to the project. Again, the sign is made locally. This sign was made by Vermont Timber Home Company. And we tell the story of the dam. You can see that bottom is a timeline, when the first dam was built, why. There's often 2 or 3 different iterations of a dam at a site. And then we have the whole timeline, maybe initial drawing, engineer drawing. Hard to see in this picture, but the top left tells the background, who built the dam and why. And then on the right, where there's a brook trout picture, we talk about the reasons why we removed the dam and logos of all of our partners and funders. So if you're walking on the trail, this is in Norwich. There's some hiking trails that folks would stop and look at the dam, and now they can stop and look at the remnant parts of the dam that are no longer in the channel, and the sign that tells the whole history. Now, it was a really big issue in East Burke. We wanted to capture that history, because when I first went there, well before I was doing this project, just to fish, I just saw an old crumbling dam. I didn't know any of the history, and it's got some really cool history, and it's neat to capture that and to help tell that story. Back in World War II, the mill in East Burke was a lumber mill, and the wood from East Burke, Vermont was used to make toilet seats for the U.S. Army, and was shipped all over the world during World War II. And so those kind of stories, I think, are important to capture as part of these projects, so that we are honoring the history of the folks that, local folks that built the dam, and also, prior to the dam, and working with the Abenaki tribes and others to tell that whole story. So here is another one, Clark Brook. When I'm getting a message, 5 minutes. All right, thank you. We did 2 dams. So Clark Brook in Haverhill, New Hampshire is direct tributary to the Connecticut River. There were 2 dams on it. So if you're going to do one, you got to do both, to get that fish passage benefit. This one, the mill building, is over here on the left. The dam was still attached to it. Every spring, this would happen. It would fill up with water, and the mill building is now an apartment complex. So people that were living there had to, talk about liability issues, and I wouldn't want to live there every spring, but there it is now. There's the mill building on the left. As you can see, we cut the dam, the nice smooth sides like that one picture I showed you earlier. That's how, the 19 feet thick at the bottom. And then essentially we recreate the channel, that stream channel here is part of the project also. So the engineers design, they get the slope and the meander, and we recreate a natural looking stream channel. And then we come in and plant this area. That's just grass seed and mix there. So in the fall after, or the spring after these projects, we come in and replant the area. So we put 1,200 trees and shrubs in there this spring. That's the other dam on Clark Brook, Clark Pond Dam. And this one, there's a pond up above it. And so we had to create a fishway. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service designed it so that the brook trout could get up through this elevation change, either up into the pond or down out of the pond. I think a brief video here of the Clark Brook or Clark Pond dam removal. Yeah, without the video sound, that's not going to do much good, but just loading the concrete out into the trucks, essentially what we're showing there. And then this is the sediment removal in Norwich. This is the one where we had 750 truckloads. And I'm playing traffic control cop there and make sure no one comes down the hill. Can't see the dam, but it is down there. This is our access road. All the equipment went in and out of there. And there goes a truckload of, looks like concrete. So 750 times during that project that happened. That scene right there occurred. Those trucks, triaxle trucks, they carry about 15 cubic yards of sediment. So do the math, 753 times 15, somewhere in the neighborhood of 11, 12,000 cubic yards of sediment and concrete went out of there. And then the last piece is restoration. As I mentioned, after these projects are done, we come in and we replant, all those disturbed areas where the excavator and trucks were. That upper picture was Clark Pond Dam, very rocky site. We did live stakes, so those are willow and red osier dogwood live stakes, pound them into the ground, they root and they send out shoots. And in a few years, there'll be 6-foot high shrubs along that spillway, that fishway that we created. The one picture below is Norwich. We worked with the local 5th grade Norwich Elementary School kids, and they helped us with some of the plantings there. So great way to get people involved. Volunteers, it's hard for volunteers to do much in terms of dam removal. They're not going to be out there operating the excavators, but they can really help with the restoration. Top right picture is East Burke tree planting, and often we'll come back and do more than just one. We might do it in the fall, do the dam removal in the summer, and then do tree planting in the fall, and we might come back, in the spring and hit it again. We don't always get, 100% survival, so replanting. The black pots, those are just potted plants. This is the project down in Dummerston. Kathy and I and Kathy's son helped with that planting. There were 200 stems, all local species that, we see what's on site and try to plant a lot of that same stuff. So it might be red osier dog or silver maples or red maples, etc. And timing, at minimum, it takes 3 years. Best case scenario, once we find a project, you've got the planning, the fundraising, engineering takes time, permitting, more grant writing, fundraising. A year of construction, again, in the summer, between July 1 and October 1, we're doing these in-stream projects. And then that fall, the restoration. And then monitoring. Our permits often require us to monitor the sites to make sure there's not excessive erosion or some other issue. So we are, depending on the project, required to monitor for 3 to 5 years after the removals are done. All right, Stacy, I think that's my basic overview. If we have questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Ron. It was so great to see the whole project from soup to nuts and everything that goes into it. Really appreciate that. Reminder to folks to type in your questions in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to as many as we have time for. So we have a few here. This may have been covered a bit about the sediment, but I'll read it anyway if you want to reiterate. When you do a dam removal, when and how during the removal is the sediment taken away to avoid having it all move downstream? And the second part was about where the fill gets used. I think you did address that.
Yep. So each project is somewhat unique and different. Sometimes because the sediment is trapped upstream of the dam, the downstream of the dam is actually what they call sediment starved. So the engineers come in and they do an assessment and they say, okay, let's say there's 10,000 cubic yards of sediment trapped above the dam. And they do an assessment downstream of the dam also, and they say the downstream reach is sediment starved. And so we come up with a calculation, and the permit agencies are involved in this. So of that 10,000 cubic yards, they might decide to remove, half of it or 3/4 of it and let the other part of the sediment go downstream as part of the project to make that lower stretch more natural, right? To get sediment in there on purpose because they are so sediment starved. You know, the river starts cutting down, gets incised, the flood waters can't get up out onto the floodplain as they normally would when there's that sediment. So there are benefits to them. That's why we have to do this projects in the summer, though. They don't want these projects done in the spring or the fall because then the sediment would potentially kill, fish eggs and other eggs that are happening that time of year. So that's why it's only in the summer. As far as the what was the other part of the question, Stacy? Sorry.
About what the sediment is used for. You mentioned it being sort of recycled for other uses.
Yep. If we can find someone that wants it, needs it, and can put it to good use, that is great. In Norwich, we didn't have that. Town couldn't take it. We didn't find anybody else that needed it. So we found the closest pit, and we paid, to have that sediment put in those pits. Again, they're approved areas, and it's a lot of times it's muddy. It's not very good material that you wouldn't necessarily want. So, all right, what's the next one?
So we have someone all the way down in Florida asking, why are they called deadbeat dams?
Good question. I would say that is a PR term, right? Someone well before me said, deadbeat dams because they're no longer serving a purpose. It's a bit of a controversial term, I guess. We like to say a dam with no useful purpose. So just to sort of draw the distinction that we're not removing actively used dams. We're not removing active hydro dams or flood control dams. These are all old dams that were built often long ago. But even if they were built more recently, like in the 80s, the purpose for them being built is not being used anymore. And the other thing I should talk about is, we often hear from folks like, well, why don't we rehab that dam to make it into an existing hydro? And it is so expensive. Like that East Burke Dam, if you tried to, the dam is, you have to remove the dam first to build a new dam. And right now, electric rates are so low that building one dam for small hydro is not profitable. So there are very few people that are doing it. And if they are doing it, they usually have multiple dams on a stream where they can string together enough water and profit to make it worth their while. Because they're not going to spend $1 million to then hopefully break even over 20 years.
Sure. What are the biggest impediments in getting dam removals today? For example, finding funding, getting buy-in from stakeholders, et cetera.
Funding obviously is the big nut to crack. We have, I think right now we have 10 or 12 additional projects that we're working on. So even if we do 3 a year, which is flat out, that's another 4 years of work. And they take 3 years minimum for each one to happen. So it's not a matter of finding, there are 1,000 of these old dams out there, and we're talking to dam owners and they're reaching out to us and others. But their funding, minimum one small project might be $15,000 is the lowest amount we've had to spend. But the Norwich or East Burke can cost $350,000. We've got 2 right now, big projects that could be $1 million projects. So funding was definitely the biggest hurdle.
Okay. What fish species benefit most from the dam removals?
Up here in Vermont, New Hampshire, it's mostly brook trout. That's where the funding is. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and state fisheries are focused on brook trout, but also mussels. We have an endangered dwarf wedge mussel in the Connecticut River. So those Clark Brook Dam removals help the brook trout that are in Clark Brook, but they also potentially could help the dwarf wedge mussels that are in the Connecticut River. Those mussels species move and expand their range by attaching the young to host fish. So a slimy sculpin minnow that is down in the Connecticut River and swims up into Clark Brook now, because those dam removals are gone, could potentially expand the territory of those endangered dwarf wedge mussels. So there's funding tied to specific species of fish and mussels for most of this work.
Great. If there is significant objection downstream to a dam removal, how is the decision to remove the dam ultimately determined?
Well, ultimately, you know, if it's privately owned, it's the dam owner's choice. You know, most of the folks we're working with are private landowners, and the dam is on their property. Sometimes, you know, the hurdles are just making sure that we've done all the necessary evaluations and studies, and all that's required by the permitting. So in order to get the permits to do that project, we have to do it. If it's a town-owned project, like the one in East Burke, well, that wasn't town-owned, but it was in the middle of town. We're working with the town of Barnet right now. They own a dam by Harvey's Lake. And obviously the town will make that final decision if they want to go forward with the project or not. But it comes down, you know, like most private property issues, it comes down to a decision of the folks that own it, and then doing what you need to do, all the necessary steps to get the permits.
Right. This is a good follow-up to that. How do you prioritize among competing opportunities for removals?
Oh, good question. There are some inventories of dams. There's a couple different ones, and they have prioritized them based on ecological benefits. So the number of miles that you might open, right? So like that East Burke Dam removal opening 99 miles, that makes it a high priority, as opposed to a dam removal that might open 1 mile of fish passage or brook trout habitat. The Nature Conservancy has done some work in Vermont. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has their own ranking. There's another foundation, New Hampshire Charitable Foundation has a ranking. So, you know, New Hampshire Charitable Foundation says, here are our top 10 dam removals, and we'll pay for those dams to be removed. But sometimes, you know, to be honest, we are opportunistic. And if someone calls and says, hey, I've got a dam in my backyard, if, you know, I'm willing to let you guys remove it if you want to. You know, if you have a willing landowner, even if it's not the highest ranking on someone's priority list, if it's a brook trout stream or a mussel, an endangered mussel stream, like the West River in Vermont, then, you know, those projects could go up the list because you have a willing landowner.
Makes sense. Are formal cost benefits of these dam removal projects done after the project is completed? And are there new benefits recognized only after the dam is removed?
There's no formal cost benefit analysis. You know, we do often take into consideration the cost. One of the first steps we take is a preliminary assessment and a cost analysis. Then the engineers do an opinion of probable cost. And, you know, so for example, if you're going to open a mile of stream on this brook trout stream and it's going to cost $1 million to do the project, probably that's not going to, you know, rise to everybody's let's get this done. The state and the feds are going to say, you know, we could spend that $1 million somewhere else and get more bang for our buck. So it's not a formal cost benefit analysis, but it's an informal process that we and our partners go through with that early onset, so we don't get too far down the road. We don't want to spend a ton of money on engineering and design and then not be able to do the project.
Sure. And to the second part, any new benefits that you realize after the dam is removed? Has that come up?
Occasionally, you know, we'll find something that we didn't know was there. You know, the initial assessment work is somewhat limited in its scope. Well, like for example, in East Burke, those stair step falls, we didn't know those were there. There's no way to know they were there. They were buried under 8 or 9 feet of sediment and concrete. So there are, you know, pleasant surprises that sometimes come about that are beneficial in that case to recreation, as you saw in those videos.
Yeah, I can add that I had the opportunity to go paddling on the Ashuela, and seeing the picture where you had taken out the dam, I realized, oh, I was able to paddle right through that, hit a few rocks because the water was low, but I encourage people to get on out if you can. There's one more question here. I think you may have already talked about it, but I'll throw it out there. Are there any agreed upon benefits of dams in Vermont, though I'm sure this is for anywhere, benefits to the public, for example, significant hydro, flood control, etc.? I assume they
Sure.
mean if you were to keep the dam.
Yeah, not with any of the old dams that we're removing, but the existing dams. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers have several hydro flood control dams. We've got hydro dams on the Connecticut River up and down, and also in the Deerfield River. So there's lots of our rivers that still have active dams that are serving a useful purpose. And again, that's why we're focusing on these old dams that aren't serving a useful purpose for removal projects. And just, this work is happening all over Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, Massachusetts, Connecticut. Again, there are thousands in the East Coast, at least, there are thousands of these, dams that were created for all sorts of purposes. A lot of them were mills, and we have a lifetime of work ahead of us. So there's no reason really to pick a controversial project or to spend a bunch of money on a project that, most people are opposed to, et cetera. There's always another one right around the corner.
Okay, here's another one came in. After removing 14 or so dams, do you see visible evidence of improved fish and habitat life?
Yeah, and the great thing about it is it's immediate. When we're doing tree plantings, we know that in 20 years that tree is, that silver maple is going to grow up and be 20 feet high or 40 feet high. So it's more long term. My analogy for dam removals, it's if you've ever hayed, it's like filling the barn with hay, right? It's a long project. You're hot, you're tired, your hands hurt, but at the end of the day, you look in the barn and it's full of hay and you say, we accomplished something. Same way with the dam removal. The concrete is gone, the stream is restored. We get fish passage immediately. I mean, we've done some assessment work with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and we're seeing the fish swim through. The one in West Fairleigh, the Gear Dam, I've got a picture of a brook trout, a bigger brook trout than I would have ever guessed was in that river. And as we were doing the dam removal, we had stopped, and the contractor, the engineer, and I were talking about something. And the engineer looked down and was like, "Oh my God, look at that brook trout." And there was a brook trout like 2 feet from this big yellow excavator in the river. And the stream was partially open, so that flow had increased, and that fish had sensed it and come up in there and was basically waiting for us to get the hell out of the way, finish that project so I can get upstream. It has immediate benefits. They have done some fin clips, and they'll shock and they'll find fish that were below the dam that are now above the dam. But generally, state and fisheries biologists keep that stuff to culvert projects and stuff where you're putting something back in the river. With dam removals, fish passes is insured, and hopefully the mussels will see, that's going to be a little longer term research there, but hopefully we'll start seeing some benefits for the mussels. Obviously there's immediate benefits with water quality improvements for the mussels, but if we're lucky, maybe they'll start expanding their territory in the years ahead.
Great. Well, that's perfect. It's the end of our time, and we got to everybody's questions. Thank you so much, Ron, for sharing all of your expertise and enthusiasm for this project. I will be sending out an email later today, actually, with a site on where you can watch this recording. You can ask some more questions. You can see recordings of other episodes as well as our upcoming episodes. We're going all the way through the summer, and if things go well, we may continue into the fall. Thanks again to everybody for coming out today and sharing your curiosity. and to Aliki behind the scenes for helping us get the technical things going on here. And we're just so happy to share our work with you in this way. Please, in that email that I send later, there'll be a survey. You can give us your feedback on today's presentation. And if you have ideas for future episodes, we'd love to hear that too. And perhaps Ron can share with us in the last minute any upcoming projects you have for this year.
Yep, we've got 2 dam removals slated this year, both in Vermont, one with the private landowner, the daycare business I referred to earlier, and with Magic Mountain. Ski resort has an old dam on a brook trout stream, Thompsonburg Brook in Londonderry, Vermont, and we'll be removing those. Probably start in July on the one and go right up probably to September, somewhere in that neighborhood. So couple of them this year. Several of them we're doing engineering right now and writing grants to try to find the funding to do those projects in 2022.
Great. And just finally, people may want to know, is there opportunity to watch or witness any of these in real time?
Occasionally we'll do, it depends on the site. If we're in someone's backyard, that's a little harder to have a dam removal party. We did do one in East Burke and Norwich, where we're a little bigger sites. We have to be somewhat careful to keep, out of the way when there's big equipment. But yeah, you can stay in touch with us. Check with myself or Stacy for events, because we do occasionally do site visits where you can actually see that work being done. It is pretty interesting. And like I said, it's very loud and dusty and dirty.
All right, great. Thanks so much, Ron. Thanks everyone for joining us. We'll see you next time.